Good morning, good morning, good morning. I realize that we are running a bit late, so please continue getting coffee or settling in, but I'm going to go ahead and start to make sure I get through the basic material today. We've had a number of special speakers, which were wonderful, I hope. I enjoyed them, but we are now going to attempt to get back to our theme of being with the road to reconciliation. I'm going to review a bit what we have already done, hopefully bringing back to memory what we discussed before, and then I'll proceed with a few more matters that'll set us up for the rest of the course. The title of the lecture this morning is Reconceiving the Divine Purpose. Reconceiving the Divine Purpose. You will remember that we began by looking at what we were calling the human predicament. What is the great challenge which seems to define our lives? And traditionally that's been thought of as death, as the fear of death. And I was claiming that I think it's not death any longer, it's isolation. Not death any longer, but isolation. We looked at poverty, and I tried to use isolation as a way of explaining some of the challenges we face in dealing with poverty and we concluded by noting that many of our efforts to diminish the limits on our lives or extend or delay mortality have in fact increased isolation, I made those problems worse. And then last week we talked about Frankenstein? And I hope what you got out of Frankenstein was a different definition of isolation. So that isolation is not just separation, though it can be that. It also includes not being seen and not being heard. You are isolated when you are not seen or you are not heard. So it's not just physical separation. It's also this sense of just not being part of things. Having set up that movement from mortality to isolation as the primary focus, we then looked at redefining what it means to do good. If we're change our notion of the human predicament, then naturally we'll also have to reassess what it means to do good. And I gave you the example of walking through a park and seeing a homeless person sitting there. This is actually a homeless person in Trafalgar Square, which is where St. Martin's in the Fields is, which is where Sam Wells serves as the vicar. And Sam Wells suggests there are 4 ways to think about how you relate to that person. You could decide you're going to work for them. You could notice their presence and go out and volunteer at a shelter, or a feeding program, or some other effort to solve and address the homeless problem. That would be working for that person. Or you could work with that person. You could stop and tell them where the shelter was, or offer a sandwich to ensure that they were fed, or drink to ensure that they were not thirsty. That would be working with them. But being with, the kind of focus of our discussions would be to sit down and talk to them. Out of that connection might arise things that you can do for them or with them, but it would start simply with, and most importantly, being with them. And then we had a wonderful story of actually meeting somebody in a coffee shop and forming a lifelong friendship by, if I recount the story, it was an offer to buy a cup of coffee for somebody in a coffee shop that looked like maybe they were unhoused, and having them say gently and kindly, "Thank you, I can buy my own cup of coffee, but why don't you get a cup of coffee and come talk with me?" And out of that talk, a relationship emerged, beneficial to both parties. Did I get the story right? I thought that was a beautiful illustration of being with. And then finally, you could be for. You could walk through the park, notice what was going on, go off and simply protest or argue or whatever else you thought you needed to do to be for the people in that park. Now, I don't mean to suggest that any of these ways of being are bad. I only mean to suggest that if isolation is what we're worried about, that being with is the place to start. Does that make some sense? If it's the lack of relationship we think is fundamental, then the restoration of relationship would be the primary response. That's my claim. So if we have a different notion of what doing good is, the restoration of relationship, then naturally, I think, that leads us to think about reconciliation as a Christian practice. Reconciliation as a Christian practice. And I would argue that it is the primary Christian practice and really always has been. If you go to the Catechism at the back of the prayer book, you will see that restoring relationships with God and with other people is in fact the mission of the church. Think about that. That's the 1979 prayer book, and it's drawing on more historical resources. The mission of the church is to restore our relationship with God and that of other people, or reconciliation. The challenge, I think, of reconciliation is that our experience of conflict invariably involves one or both of two things: exasperation and impatience. Our efforts at reconciliation leaves us at some point being exasperated or impatient. So I want to explore each of those two states of being and talk about why they get in the way. I assume you recognize these figures. Unlikely to reconcile anytime soon. Exasperation might be defined as rooted in the idea that the conflict is ridiculous. You see both of the two people at the end of this negotiating table at a international peace negotiation both seem just exasperated to me with what's happening. But the challenge, I think, for all of us is that sense that the conflict is ridiculous can lead us to assume that the enemy, the other, is either stupid or perverse, because if they were faithful, there wouldn't be any conflict. You with me on that? If the conflict is ridiculous, then anybody engaged in it must have a major challenge, either stupid or perverse. Those words may sound harsh, but if you think for a minute, I hope you can see them in conflicts and efforts to reconcile that you've been part of. There's something I think we naturally experience and have to address and overcome. But it's not our natural move. Our natural move, I think, is more like what comes out of what I'll call the parable of the Russian train. This is an old story. The story is that the train breaks down on a snowy night in the forest. And so Lenin, who just happens to be on the train, is the first one to address the problem. He immediately goes up to the engineer and begins to re-educate him. You're old enough to think this is funny, I think. He goes up and to re-educate him. That doesn't work, of course, so Stalin takes over. Well, Stalin goes up and simply shoots the engineer. That doesn't work too well either, so Brezhnev takes charge, and Brezhnev simply pulls down the shades all along the train and tells everybody that everything is fine. Humorous, I hope, but also illustrative of the way we go about dealing with things. So we can re-educate, or we can force, or we can simply deny. None of which ultimately work very much, but all of which have this fundamental assumption, I think, that the problem is not the train, the problem is the other people on it. The problem is the other people on it, the stupid, perverse people that don't see the wisdom of the obvious solution. Now, to be on a Russian train at midnight is a little heavy, so let me give you a lighter kind of example of this. Humorous, but I think gets at this notion of exasperation. It's obvious, why do you not hear it? Well, you can only think it's because you are stupid or perverse, and yet getting to that place, as you can imagine, makes reconciliation very, very difficult. All right, what about the other component, impatience? Well, impatience assumes that the conflict is wasteful. It's taking up time and effort that could be better used on things that matter more, right? You've all kind of felt that, right? It's time to act. We've talked enough. It's time to do something about it. That's impatience. First of all, I'll say this is a picture of George Bush on the eve of invading Iraq, when I think we were all impatient as a country. And we went in under those circumstances. You can see it, though, across our efforts at reconciliation. But impatience can lead to a complete break of relationship and rarely actually accomplishes what it desires. Again, Iraq's a little heavy, so let's take a lighter look at that. This is Bob Newhart, the master of all wisdom. I love this clip. Impatience, exasperation, impatience, both of whom stand as obstacles to reconciliation. I think to go back a bit, the problem starts with difference. And difference begins in creation. If God is the essence and creation that creates the existence, then God, through creation, is creating difference. It's part and parcel of all of creation, all of our lives, and in fact, of us. And yet, how we deal with that difference has a big impact on how we're able to restore relationships. This scene, does anybody recognize this scene? This is my favorite Star Trek episode. It's titled, "Let This Be the Last Battle." So James Kirk and the Starship Enterprise arrives at a planet that is consumed in civil war. And they get into the planet and they're trying to figure out what in the world they can do. And remember, they've got all these restrictions about not altering time. So it's what can they do? How can they begin reconciling these warring parties? The problem is, despite the brilliance of James Kirk and Bones with his medical background, nobody can figure out what's the cause of this problem. What are they really fighting about? And they finally get the leaders of each of the two sides on the Enterprise, and they're standing there, and they're like, "What are you fighting about?" And the two leaders look at James Kirk, and they say, "I just can't believe, can you not see it? Can you not see it? One half of the face is white, the other half is black, but it's a different side." Look at those pictures. It's a different side. This planet is consumed in civil war because some people have the black side of their face on the right side and some on the left. Some have the white side of their face on the left side and others on the right. And out of that difference, tribes have formed and battles have been fought, and there's now a long Hatfield and McCoy's kind of history that they can't seem to overcome. A difference which might have been viewed differently, but instead is viewed as separating. Dr. Seuss gets to a similar idea in The Sneetches. Do you remember that book? Stars? Yeah, thank you, where one group has a star and then the other. So this is a difference is part and parcel of our lives, but how we deal with it depends on how we look at it. And I want to make three claims about difference. The first is that creation is the inception of difference. I've already kind of made that claim, that it's part of all of creation, difference. God intended it to be part of creation. It's a necessary element. But that yields two different opportunities for us, or an opportunity to see it in two different ways. One is that the difference that we see in the other is threatening, right? I'm looking for a life that is supportive of me. I'm looking at my human flourishing on an individual level, and you are threatening that. Because what's out there is scarce, and the more you take, the less I have. And so your mere presence is a threat. Now, even if we don't say this explicitly, if this is the assumption with which we go through the world, then we're constantly looking at people as threats, and that difference winds up being something we have to govern or control or diminish. So we start creating laws and use force to impose order to ensure that what we have will be protected, right? That's a way of looking at the world. Others inhibit our well-being. But another perspective to take is that our future, our potential, is only possible if that difference is included and used. If we don't build relationships with other people so that together we're able to accomplish something we could never accomplish alone, then we have a different approach to difference. So I offer you the symphony as an image of what is possible utilizing difference, right? Many different instruments playing at different ways, different tones, often even at times in competition or contrast with each other. And yet the sound, when it's well done, is beautiful and beyond what any one instrument could possibly do on its own, right? Does that make sense? So the symphony is I think, a good image of how the difference that's inherent in creation can yield a future for creation that cannot be conceived, much less achieved, by one instrument alone or one of us alone. That the potential of acting together is the promise of a future that we, frankly, could never have imagined by ourselves. Creation is the inception of difference. My second claim is that heaven is the perfection of that difference. When I say perfection, I mean the making whole, not the cleansing of deformity or flaw, but the making whole. Heaven is bringing all of that difference into the harmony of a well-played symphony. Reconciliation, then, is not the restoration of an untroubled condition that existed before the conflict. Let me pause there. How often do we just assume that times are hard, the conflict is difficult, and what we need is to get back to the state we were in before the conflict emerged? Whether we're talking about nation states or marriages or parent-child relationships, how often do we respond intuitively to the conflict by simply trying to get rid of the conflict? My favorite example of this is when you're a teenager and you've gotten in a fight with somebody and the teacher says, "Go say you're sorry." Like, really? How's that going to affect anything at all to say I'm sorry? But they just want it all to stop, right? So we can get back to doing what we were doing. The challenge of that, I think, is it makes us inherently nostalgic. It's like we just need to go back to that period of time. Depending on where you're on the political spectrum, it might be the 50s or the 60s, but often we just want to go back to that period of time that we think was without this conflict. But the other way to look at it is that creation is, the reconciliation is the process of creating something that would never have existed without the conflict. So while the conflict certainly at times is life-threatening, and I don't mean to make light of that, but conflict with the volume turned down a little bit is tension, right? It's just the natural, normal rubbing together that we experience going through life. And the claim I'm trying to make is that that tension can be life-enhancing. That conflict at a level that challenges us without threatening us can be life-enhancing, right? We can grow through that. I think that's true of any intimate relationship, right? Whether it's with the promises and pledges of marriage or just friendship, to get along with another person, you're going to have to change. And it's not just change to accommodate the other person. It's change that you willingly make because the other person lovingly has revealed yourself to yourself. Does that make sense? Sometimes not so lovingly, but hopefully, right? Which is the value of marriage, I think, or at least one of them. You're in a pledged, committed, covenantal relationship where every time there's a conflict, your relationship is not at risk. Right? I think if you can get to the point where your relationship is not at risk, there's a whole lot to be learned from disputes or differences or conflict. But if you think the relationship is at risk every time somebody's not happy, it's very difficult to experience a lot of growth. But to say that heaven is a perfection of difference is to say that conflict can be an opportunity to grow into a future you could not have imagined otherwise. That's God's promise. We can grow into a future we could not have imagined otherwise. There are two misconceptions, though, that I want to point out in this, that are revealed, I think, by this understanding, if you're with me so far. The first is how we think about peace, and the second is how we think about silence. So peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the transformation of this tension into dynamic creativity, right? Again, the promise of relationship. It's not that what I want is the absence of conflict. That's really not peace. What I want is to take this energy and turn it into something that's creative, something that is life-giving. And that's possible. This is an old icon of the Epiphany, right? The Epiphany, where the presence of Jesus creates a possibility for people in their lives they would not have seen before, which is why I think we're talking about Epiphany as kind of an aha moment, if you will. One of my favorite examples of the Epiphany, of course, is the O. Henry story. Remember the O. Henry story where the poor couple doesn't have anything to give each other for Christmas. They each only have one thing. She has her beautiful hair, and he has this watch chain. So he goes out and sells the watch chain to buy her rings for her hair, if I remember the story correctly. And she goes out and cuts her hair in order to buy him a watch. Maybe he's got a watch and she buys him a chain. Remember this story? And so then they meet each other on Christmas to give their gifts. Of course, the material gifts are worthless now. But the sacrifice made out of love is priceless, as they say on the commercial. Priceless. It's an epiphany. Silence, then, is not the absence of noise. It's a selection of which noises you're going to hear. Think about that for a minute. We think of silence as just getting rid of all the things that are distractions, but I want to claim that really it's what you're listening to. You're still listening. You're still hearing something. It may not be the blaring of the radio from your teenager's room, but it's something. And even if you're in the woods by yourself, 30 miles from the nearest road, it's something. It's something. Howard Thurman tells this great story of being a student in Rochester and New York and walking home one night when the traffic had died down and the city noises were not so present. And he heard something. It sounded like water, but he'd never heard it before, and he didn't know what to make of it. And then he went to talk to a friend and discovered the Erie River, I guess it is, runs underneath Main Street in Rochester, but he'd never heard it before because he was always captivated by cars and horns and talking and sounds. To let go of one set of noises is to avail ourselves of another. Henry David Thoreau said famously, I think I've got this right, it's not what you look at, it's what you see. It's not what you look at, it's what you see. So the whole point of spiritual practices is to let go of the attachments and passions that are clouding our vision, narrowing our scope in order that we can see more. Same concept, right? Our growth in spiritual maturity is about opening ourselves to be more present to what is there. So I hope you can see how this redefinition of peace and silence fits back into the idea of moving from being trapped by conflict and tension into the awareness that they can be generative, that they can be utilized to transform and transfigure what is uncomfortable into something that would otherwise be unimaginable. But you have to be able to stay in it. You have to be able to stay in that liminal space where you've lost something, but you don't yet know what's coming. And it's in that space, I think, where our trust in God gets tested the most, right? Where our trust in God gets tested the most. Henry Nouwen, a wonderful spiritual writer known to many of you, describes this by reference to a circus act he saw performed, the Flying Rodleys. And what the Flying Rodleys did is something you probably have seen before. They would have a catcher, a flyer, and a catcher. So the flyer would be holding on to a ring, and they would get the rings going, and the flyer would go up and do whatever somersaults he or she was going to do. And the very last move was to stretch out, having let go of the ring without a net to stretch out. And that's when the catcher was supposed to be there to catch the flyer. The trick about this is the flyer cannot grab the catcher. If the flyer grabs the catcher, the flyer will break the wrists of the catcher, and they will both fall and conceivably die. So you, the flyer, in this liminal moment, having given up the security of your swing, must be totally dependent upon, totally trusting in the catcher. Now, you've done this many times before. It's not that your trust is not founded, but still, you have no control. And you've accepted that on the promise that there's a future of being caught. And that happens every time they perform the act. And I think it's helpful for me to kind of imagine that, just to imagine that, when you're in those moments where you know you've lost something, you don't know what's coming next, but you need to act with the conviction that there is a good answer, even if you can't see it. There is a good answer, even if you can't see it, and the vanquishing of your opponent is rarely the good answer, though it is often the most satisfying answer. Again, don't get completely lost in whatever international conflict you read about this morning, because this can happen every day with your children and with your partners and with your friends and at work. But how we enter into conflict and the position we hold when threatened is a function of our faith. That's what I'm claiming. It's not about dispute resolution in a secular sense. It's a function of our faith. So the third claim I want to make about difference is that the story of God, which is the Bible, right? That is the story of God and God's people. That's what it is. It's a story of tension and conflict. A story of tension and conflict from beginning to end. So I don't know where we got the idea that tension and conflict weren't part of life, because I doubt you've been into a single Bible study, certainly not two in a row, where that wasn't an inherent, if not determining part of the pericope that you were reading and studying. But I want to focus on two stories in Genesis. You know, I think just as a side note, the way to read Genesis, much of the Bible, but Genesis in particular, is three different times. Whatever the Genesis story is, read it three different times. The first is about God. The second is about Israel. And the third is about you. You can interpret that same story in those three different ways. So in Genesis 3:9, of course, we're in the creation stories. Adam and Eve are in the garden. They've done what they're not supposed to be doing, and they've suddenly got all this anxiety and concern, and God comes out and says, "Where are you? Where are you?" That question has been asked, I think, of Israel, and that question gets asked of us. And in each case, the question is, what's our answer? When God says, "Where are you?" what is our answer? Is it, "Here I am," right? Or is it cowering behind the bush and saying nothing, hoping that God doesn't know where you are? The second moment is Genesis 4:9 with Cain and Abel. Of course, we've had this dispute between Cain and Abel, and they've made offerings to God, and God seemingly has selected Abel's offering over Cain's, and Cain doesn't like that, so he slays his brother. And then God appears and says, "Where is your brother? Where is your brother?" Now, one way to think about this story is that God doesn't like farmers. but I think a more helpful way to think about this story is to look at it in the context of Israel's history and relationship with God. So Israel goes through a long period of time through the wilderness when they're really living fundamentally on livestock and more of a day-to-day kind of life where you're dependent upon your animals for your clothing and your food and your shelter. And that was when Israel was closest to God. And then when it went through a long period of agriculture where they were able to kind of stabilize, that's when they wound up getting attracted to and committing themselves to idols, false gods, gods of other religion. So one way to look at this story is simply as a kind of coded version, coded history of Israel, in claiming that trusting in God day to day left you closer to God than thinking you could provide for yourself. Nevertheless, I think these two questions arising out of our faith stories can be helpful to us as we think about reconciliation. Because God's way, as I'm claiming, is not to eliminate tension and conflict. It's not going anywhere. You had it yesterday, you've got it today, and you're going to have it tomorrow. But we can use it to create an opportunity for discovery, transformation, intimacy, and hope, i.e., a future we wouldn't have otherwise imagined. But not if we go into it with a narrowed perspective of vanquishing our opponent and winning, which is to say, going back to the place that we last liked. We can, however, think about a future that we can go into. I've said there's no Israel without Egypt or Babylon, right? Egypt, because that is the circumstance out of which the Exodus occurs. And it is that moment, I believe, that Israel becomes a people, when they are the ones that God saves from slavery. And Babylon, because they're everything they held dear, right? Their land, their temple, they lose, and they wind up being exiled in Babylon. And it is in Babylon where they rediscover God. And you get this amazing, I think, understanding that it is our drifting from God that has caused this calamity to occur. We can talk more about how that might have happened. I don't feel like it makes sense to say God got mad and punished you. I do think it makes sense to think of how the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom split from each other, therefore not able to mutually defend each other, or how the rivalries inside of the southern kingdom made them vulnerable to the exile. It'd be another way of thinking about what it means to drift farther from God. But it's clear, I think, that without the Babylonian exile, there would be no Old Testament. That's when the Old Testament stories were gathered and written down and edited in this attempt to try to make sense of what had happened to the nation. And so we have the Old Testament, which, of course, you wouldn't be able to understand Christ without because of the exile. So my claim is there would be no Israel without Egypt and Babylon, and there'd be no Christ without the cross. Right? There is no Old Testament without the cross. There is no Christ without the cross. Tension and conflict are inherent to creation, and how we engage them is largely determinative of the kind of life we're able to create. So here's my fundamental claim, that reconciliation is not a precursor to the gospel. It's not something we have to do in order to get to the good stuff. That reconciliation is the gospel. Drawing near to God is to engage in conflict resolution and restoration of relationship and reconciliation with God and each other. Does that make some sense? It's not that we need to solve all this conflict so we can get back to what's real. It's that being in that conflict and working towards this resolution is what's real. And how we do that is a product of our faith. Because we have assumptions and perspectives and commitments that arise out of our faith that I think would lead us into that conflict and the potential for reconciliation in a different way, because we have a different goal. Our goal is not vanquishing our enemy. Our goal is emerging from that conflict new and revitalized. Not easy, but it's a different perspective. So I think there's nothing more important than reconciliation. This is a Byzantine icon of Peter and Paul, speaking of reconciliation, right? There's our whole church premised on Peter and Paul, who, as far as I could tell, fought their entire lives when they were together and when they were not. They were trying to do different things. They would come together. Paul would say, you have to kind of lighten up on these Jewish laws of identity. And Peter would say, okay. And then Paul would say, fine, I'm going to go back and continue collecting money for the Jerusalem community. And Peter would go back to Jerusalem and they would say, you did what? And then he would recant what he'd agreed, and then you go back at it. And yet, without either one of them, there wouldn't be a church. So there's a theological question that gets to the point I'm trying to make. Did Jesus come in response to the fall? You with me on this? Did Jesus come because of Adam and Eve eating the apple? And if they had not eaten the apple, Jesus would have never had to come because there'd been nothing for him to do. Does that sound familiar? It's a widely held theological principle, so I'm not just making this up. Here's the alternative, though. Was Jesus always going to come? Was that part of God's plan for creation, part of the vision of creation, that God would be with us in human form in the most profound way? That creation could never work its way towards completion without that happening. The fall may have been inevitable, but it wasn't a trigger. It was God's plan from the beginning to be with us, and slowly, in ways that we could understand, was with us as a way of being in relationship with us. You don't have to answer this question now, but I want you to see the difference, because I think the church has for a long time just assumed that there's the fall. This is where the harder conceptions of original sin come from, right? There's the fall. We're depraved. Jesus has come, sacrificed himself to appease God so that we would enjoy some kind of salvation. But there's another way to look at it, which is Jesus was always coming. And while we killed Jesus and Jesus revealed who we were to us, Jesus ultimately chose us. All right. As usual, I could go on for a while. As usual, you probably don't need me to. So I'm going to try to wrap it up quickly, which is, what do we do now? So I get it. It's not mortality, it's isolation. I get it. Isolation is not being seen or heard, not just being physically separated from. I get it. That may change what doing good actually means so that restoration of relationship, reconciliation, has a priority and importance that I hadn't seen before. I get it. That ought to lead me into conflict and tension with different assumptions and commitments. I want to say that I think in that understanding is an opportunity to rediscover the heart of God. To rediscover the heart of God. This is another Byzantine icon. This is Jesus sitting on the judgment seat. Paul in Philippians said Jesus will sit on the judgment seat and we'll all have to go and present ourselves to Jesus. Not a verse that gets read a lot in the Episcopal Church, but it's there. Paul said it. So I think what we can do as a spiritual practice, always, but when you're in a moment of conflict and when you're feeling like you can't see what to do next, the question God asks can be asked of us: where are you? Where are you? God asked that question of Adam and Eve in the garden. They had a choice to make. They could step up to God despite everything that happened, or they could hide from God, trying to avoid the consequences of what they had done, which they didn't understand. Where are you? The second question would be, where is your brother? This is what God said to Cain: where is your brother? Which is what forced Cain to have to own up to what he did in killing his brother. What's the answer to these questions? I think fundamentally the answer is the same. The answer that God wants, right here beside me. Where are you? Right here beside you. Where is your brother? Right here beside me. That's the promise of reconciliation. There's an old story of going to heaven, the great master teacher going to heaven, believing that his performance in life had been superb, that his faults were minor and God would probably overlook them, and that his promise of eternity in heaven was assured. And he appeared before God and was ready to answer all the questions to justify himself, prove himself as worthy of this promise. And instead, God asked only one question. Where is everybody else? Where is everybody else? Yes, you've done all these things. Yes, you've been superb. Yes, you've been a master theologian. Yes, you have done all kinds of good. But while that distinguished you in some ways from everybody else, where is everybody else? As if to say your job was to bring everybody with you, and instead you came alone. This concept, interestingly, also appears in several other religions, in Hindu in particular. The whole notion of a bodhisattva, I think, is someone who reaches enlightenment, is entitled to move on to the next life and does not. Instead, stays here on earth in order to be of light and help to others. These two questions are helpful, I think, as we go through our own growth in rediscovering the heart of God. Where are you, and where is your brother? And our hope as we mature is that we increasingly are able to say with greater and greater confidence, right here beside me. But it ain't easy. Amen. All right, I think I've skillfully gone right to the hour so that there are no opportunities really for questions, but that's kind of okay. We'll come back and address some of this. I just want it to sink in for a while. I want you to think about taking a slightly different perspective and see how that feels. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.